They called it the impossible sale. 12 transactions in 6 months. 12 men who paid fortunes to own me and returned me within days, pale and shaking and refusing to explain why. The auctioneer Jean-Baptiste Mur recorded each return in his ledger with the handwriting of a man trying not to think too hard about what he was writing. Returned. Defect in character. Unsuitable. Bad omen. Incompatible with domestic peace. He burned that ledger in 1852. Someone had made a copy. My name is Amara Cavalier. I was born in 1820 on the land my father called home, 300 acres of rich black soil in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, land that had belonged to the Cavalier family since 1790, when my grandfather received a Spanish land grant and built something from nothing in the Louisiana heat. I was 5 years old when the fire came. I was the only one who ran fast enough. What happened to my family in 1825 is not a ghost story. It is not a mystery. It is not the supernatural phenomenon that the newspapers of New Orleans debated in their drawing rooms and their columns and their careful avoidance of the plainest possible explanation for what I did in 1851. What happened to my family was murder, arson, land theft, the specific crimes of a specific man named Thorne who wanted our land and understood that the fastest way to acquire it was to remove the people standing on it. I spent 26 years working my way back to the evidence of that crime, not running toward it, working my way back, through the auction houses of New Orleans and the plantation houses of Louisiana's wealthiest families, and the specific vulnerabilities of men who believed that what they owned could not look back at them. Working my way back through 12 sales and 12 returns and 12 destroyed reputations, and the accumulated weight of 26 years of patience so complete and so cold that the men who encountered it called it supernatural because they had no other framework for a woman who was not afraid of them. I was never afraid of them. I had survived the worst thing any of them could do when I was 5 years old. Everything after that was simply navigation. This is not a ghost story. This is the account of a woman who had a plan. I remember the night of the fire in the specific way that the mind preserves the things it most needs to remember and most needs to survive having remembered, not as a continuous narrative, as a sequence of images, each one precise and permanent, burned into me the way the fire burned everything else. My father's voice first, not words, the specific quality of his voice when something was wrong, the change in register that a child recognizes before she understands language. I was in the back room of our cabin, the small room my parents had partitioned for me from the larger space, sleeping on the pallet my mother had stuffed with Spanish moss and covered with a quilt she had made the winter before from scraps of cloth accumulated over 2 years of careful saving. The voice, then the smell. Wood smoke, which was familiar. The smell of every evening when my mother cooked, but different in quality, thicker and faster and carrying something underneath it that the normal cooking fire never carried. The smell of something being consumed rather than something burning for purpose. The smell of a structure rather than a log. The smell of a life rather than a fire. My mother's hands next. She was in the room before I was fully awake, pulling me from the pallet with the specific urgency of hands that have made a decision and are executing it without hesitation. She did not speak. There was no time for speech, and she understood this with the clarity of a woman who had been preparing for catastrophe her entire life, because catastrophe was simply the condition of the world she lived in. She pulled me to the window at the back of the cabin, the small window that looked out toward the swamp, and she lifted me through it with both hands, her palms flat against my ribs, warm and certain, and saying without words everything that could not be said in the time available. She said 2 words, in the French that was our family's private language, the French of Louisiana's free black Creole community that my grandfather had spoken and my father had spoken, and that I speak still 64 years later, when I want to say something that belongs entirely to myself. Cours, chérie, run, my darling. I ran. I was 5 years old, and I ran into the swamp in my sleeping clothes, with nothing in my hands and nothing on my feet, and the fire behind me turning the Louisiana night orange and red and gold, and consuming everything I had ever known in the world. I ran the way my father had taught me to run through the swamp, not in a straight line, but in the zigzag pattern that avoided the soft ground, that kept me on the solid root systems of the cypress trees, that took me deeper and deeper into the darkness where the fire's light could not reach. I ran until the swamp closed around me completely, until the cypress trees and the black water and the Spanish moss swallowed the orange glow behind me and replaced it with darkness so absolute I could not see my own hands in front of my face. I stopped when I could no longer hear anything except the swamp's own sounds: frogs, insects, the distant cry of a night bird navigating by instinct through the dark. I stood in ankle-deep water in the darkness, and I listened and I heard nothing human, and I understood, with the specific understanding of a 5-year-old child who has just been handed the full weight of the worst possible thing, that I was alone. I did not cry. I have thought about this many times in the 64 years since, why I did not cry. I was 5 years old and I had just lost everything, and I stood in a Louisiana swamp in the middle of the night in my sleeping clothes, and I did not make a sound. I think what happened was that the grief was too large for crying, that it occupied a space in me that was too deep and too fundamental for the ordinary expressions of loss, that it went somewhere interior and essential, where it sat for 26 years, cold and patient and accumulating, waiting for the moment when it could finally be put to its proper use. I stayed in the swamp for 3 days. I knew it the way children know the geography of their earliest world, completely and physically in the body rather than the mind. My father had taken me there many times from the time I could walk, teaching me which plants were edible and which would harm me, where the ground was solid and where it would pull you under, how to move through the water without disturbing the things that lived in it. He taught me the swamp as survival knowledge, with the patient precision of a free black man in St. Landry Parish in 1825 who understood that the distance between safety and catastrophe was smaller than comfort suggested, and that his daughter needed to know how to navigate both. He taught me well. I survived. On the 3rd day, a woman found me. Her name was Celestine, an enslaved woman from the neighboring Fontenot property who had heard about the fire and who came into the swamp on her own initiative, without permission, without telling anyone where she was going, because she was the kind of woman who does what needs to be done, regardless of the frameworks that surround the doing. She found me sitting on a cypress root, eating the berries my father had taught me were safe, watching the direction from which the fire had come with the steady attention of a child who has decided to remember everything. She brought me to her cabin. She fed me and dried my clothes and wrapped me in a blanket and sat beside me in silence for an hour before she said anything. Then she asked me my name and I told her. She asked me what I had seen and I told her that too. All of it. In the precise sequential detail that I would maintain for the next 26 years, adding nothing and removing nothing, keeping the account exact because I understood even at 5 years old that exactness was its value. She listened to everything and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Child, you cannot tell this story to white people, not yet. Do you understand me?" I understood her completely. I was 5 years old, but I had been raised by a father who understood the specific dangers of truth in Louisiana in 1825, and who had communicated those dangers to me in the ongoing way that black parents communicated danger to their children, not as a single conversation, but as a continuous education woven into every interaction. I understood that what I carried was dangerous. I understood that the danger came not from the truth itself, but from the people the truth implicated. I understood that I had to wait. I told her I understood, and I meant it, and I waited for 26 years, and I was ready when the waiting was over. Celestine kept me for 2 months before the situation became dangerous. The people who had burned the Cavalier land were watching for survivors, she told me. Keeping me was a risk that could not be sustained indefinitely without endangering herself and everyone around her. She arranged through the networks of free black and enslaved communities in St. Landry Parish to move me to New Orleans, to a free black woman named Marguerite who ran a laundry on the edge of the French Quarter and who took in children who had nowhere else to go with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who has simply decided that this is what she does. I lived with Marguerite from age 5 to age 12. 7 years in which I understood clearly that I was not her child and did not behave as if I were, not out of coldness, but out of the specific discipline that grief requires when it has nowhere to go except inward. I worked, I learned, I observed everything around me with the attention of someone who has learned that observation is survival, and that the details most people overlook are the details that matter most. The learning was the thing I held on to with the most intention. Marguerite's laundry served the households of the French Quarter's Creole elite, which meant that books and newspapers and documents passed through her hands regularly, left in coat pockets and folded into tablecloths from households where reading was as unremarkable as breathing. Marguerite could not read herself. She had no objection to my learning. I taught myself to read from the fragments that came through the laundry, piecing together the connection between marks and meaning the way you piece together any puzzle, starting with the relationships that are most obvious and building outward. By age 8, I could read French fluently, the French of educated New Orleans rather than just the Creole of my family. By 10, I had added English, taught in a back room on Sunday afternoons by a free black man named Auguste, who asked nothing in return except attention. By 12, I had begun teaching myself Spanish from a grammar book that arrived in the pocket of a coat belonging to a merchant who traded with Cuba and who never claimed the coat. 3 languages by 12. Not a curiosity, a tool I was building for a purpose I had not yet fully articulated, but that I felt the shape of, that I understood, was going to require more than survival. It was going to require precision. At 12, the situation in Marguerite's household changed. A neighbor had begun to ask questions about the quiet child with the watchful eyes who worked in the laundry. Marguerite made another arrangement, this time placing me in the household of a free black family named Duvivier, whose patriarch was a notary in the French Quarter, with connections to both the white Creole establishment and the free black community that made him one of the most strategically positioned men I had ever observed. Monsieur Duvivier was the person who completed my education, not deliberately, not as a project, but as a consequence of my presence in his household, which was a household where legal documents were as ordinary as furniture, and where I absorbed through proximity and attention and the careful reading of everything available to me an understanding of Louisiana law, property rights, notarial practice, and the specific legal architecture of New Orleans's slave economy that I would eventually use with a precision that made grown men tremble. I read his case files, not by stealing them, by cleaning around them, dusting shelves, organizing storage, being present in the spaces where documents lived, with the quiet invisibility of a domestic servant whose presence is too unremarkable to register as a threat. I read everything I could reach, and I remembered everything I read, and I filed it in the interior architecture of my mind, alongside the 2 things I had been carrying since age 5. The memory of the fire, and the name of the man who had ordered it. Thorne. Leonidas Thorne. I had heard the name at age 5, shouted in the darkness outside our cabin in the minutes before my mother pushed me through the window. I had confirmed it at age 7, when Celestine, in one of the letters she sent me through the network that connected us, told me what she had been able to determine about what had happened to the Cavalier land. And I had spent the subsequent years building around that name a comprehensive understanding of the man who carried it, his political position, his financial arrangements, his social networks, his vulnerabilities. I was 21 years old when Monsieur Duvivier's household became unable to keep me safely. The reasons were complicated and political and related to the increasing scrutiny of free black households in New Orleans in the 1840s as the city's slaveholding establishment grew more anxious about the existence of a substantial free black community in its midst. I was placed, through a chain of misfortune and the specific cruelties of Louisiana law, into a situation that converted my legal status from free to enslaved in a process so common and so legally sanctioned that it barely generated comment. I will not detail the specific mechanism because the mechanism is less important than the outcome, and the outcome is what the rest of this account is about. What I will say is that I was 21 years old and I had been planning for 16 years, and the development that converted me from free to enslaved was not, in my assessment, a catastrophe. It was a recalibration. The plan would proceed through different means than I had originally anticipated. The means were more dangerous and more costly, and would require more of me than I had expected. But the destination remained the same. I was going back to St. Landry Parish. I was going back to the Thorne estate. I was going to find the evidence of what had been done to my family. And I was going to make sure the right people saw it. The auction was not an obstacle to that plan. The auction was the path. The St. Louis Hotel on St. Louis Street in the French Quarter was the most famous auction venue in the antebellum South, a building whose architecture expressed with perfect clarity the values of the society that had constructed it. Grand, beautiful, built for the comfort of the wealthy. And in its rotunda, beneath its soaring dome, conducting business that the beauty of the surroundings was designed to normalize, to make seem as natural and unremarkable as any other commercial transaction. I arrived there in September of 1851, 31 years old, having spent the previous 9 years in a succession of household situations that had given me access to the domestic and commercial lives of New Orleans' most prominent families in ways that I used with the same methodical attention I brought to everything. I had learned things in those 9 years about the city's social architecture, about the specific men who sat at the top of it and the specific arrangements that kept them there, about the relationship between the public presentation of Louisiana's planter class and the private reality that the public presentation was designed to conceal. I had also learned things about the Thorne estate that confirmed and expanded what I already knew. The land in St. Landry Parish that should have belonged to the Cavalier family, to my family, was the foundation of Leonidas Thorne's political and financial empire. He had built his entire world on the ashes of my family's home. He was now a senator. He was powerful enough that the normal mechanisms of accountability could not touch him. He had bought the courts and the officials and the legal machinery of the parish and the state in the same way he had bought everything else in his life, with money derived from land that was not rightfully his. The normal path to justice was closed. I had spent years confirming this. Every avenue that might have been available to the daughter of a free black family murdered for their land was blocked by the same power that had committed the original crime. The law that should have protected the Cavalier land deed was administered by men whose positions Thorne had financed. The courts that should have heard the case were presided over by judges whose appointments Thorne had arranged. The political structures that should have provided recourse were the same political structures that Thorne had constructed specifically to prevent recourse. I needed a different path. And the different path ran directly through the St. Louis Hotel Rotunda. The plan I had developed over years of observation and preparation was built on a simple insight. The men who bought and sold human beings in the St. Louis Hotel were not simply engaged in commerce. They were performing identity. Every purchase was a declaration of status. Every price paid a statement about the buyer's position in Louisiana's rigid social hierarchy. The men who competed for the most expensive and most prestigious lots at the St. Louis Hotel were not driven purely by economic calculation. They were driven by the same force that drives all performance of status, the need to be seen as the kind of man who can afford and command the best of whatever is available. This performance had a vulnerability. Men who are performing status are not paying full attention to what they are actually acquiring. They are paying attention to what the acquisition says about them. And men who are not paying full attention to what they are acquiring can be surprised by it. I intended to be the surprise. My preparation for the auction was meticulous. I had spent months building my reputation through the networks of New Orleans's domestic community, the conversations that happened in kitchens and laundries and back passageways between the enslaved and free black workers who maintained the city's households and who communicated with the efficiency of people whose survival depends on information. I had cultivated a specific reputation, extraordinary intelligence, uncommon presence, the quality that the auction trade called fancy, elevated by the additional element that the men who had employed me in household positions consistently found themselves in the presence of someone whose observation of their lives was more comprehensive and more uncomfortable than they had anticipated. I had also identified the specific men in the crowd I would encounter. Through Monsieur Duvivier's professional networks, through the laundry connections from my childhood, through 9 years of careful attention to the domestic gossip of New Orleans' elite households, I had assembled a comprehensive picture of the secrets that the city's most powerful men were keeping. The infidelities, the financial frauds, the hidden families, the buried crimes, the forged documents and the stolen inheritances, and the business arrangements that would not survive public examination. I knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally, and I knew where to stand to make the men who had buried them understand that I knew. Henri Duguay was the first buyer. He paid $5,200, a price that silenced the rotunda for a full 3 seconds before the bidding closed, a price that announced to every man in the room that what had just been purchased was not ordinary. I studied Duguay from the moment he entered the rotunda. I had studied him before I entered it, through the information I had accumulated about the domestic arrangements of New Orleans' cotton merchants. But studying a man in person is different from studying him through second-hand account. In person, you read the body as well as the history. You read the specific way he carries his confidence, whether it is the confidence of a man who has nothing to hide, or the confidence of a man who has hidden things successfully for so long that he has begun to confuse concealment with innocence. Dugay's confidence was the second kind. I recognized it immediately, the slightly excessive ease, the laugh that arrived a half-second too quickly in social situations, compensating for something underneath it, the way his eyes moved when he thought no one was watching, checking the room, cataloguing threats with the alertness of someone who lives with the permanent low-grade anxiety of a secret that must be maintained. He had a second family. I had known this from the accounts that circulated through the domestic networks of the city, accounts specific enough to include the location and the financial arrangements and the number of children involved. What I did not know with certainty before arriving at his estate was the physical location of the evidence. I found it by following the anxiety. This is the mechanism that the newspapers called supernatural, and that the Dr. Fourier came closest to describing accurately when he wrote his notes about the mirror theory, though he overstated the mysticism of it. The mechanism was simple and entirely human. A man who is concealing something is not concealing it everywhere equally. The concealment is concentrated at the point where the evidence is located, where the physical proof of the thing he is hiding sits behind a wall or under a floorboard or inside a piece of furniture. And that concentration of concealment produces a specific quality of behavioral anxiety that is visible if you know what you are looking for. I had spent 31 years learning what to look for. The hidden letters and the locket were in the wall of the nursery. I knew this within hours of arriving at the Duguay estate, not because I could see through walls, but because I could see Dugay's behavior in that specific room, the specific quality of his avoidance, the way his eyes never rested on the northwest corner, the way his body angled away from it in the unconscious compensation of a man who has trained himself not to look at the thing he is hiding. I stood in front of that corner, and I looked at it. That was all I did. I stood there, and I looked at it with the complete steady attention that I brought to everything, and I let Duguay watch me looking at it. And I let the watching produce in him the specific anxiety that watching produces in a man who knows what is behind the wall and who has just understood that the person standing in front of it might also know. I did not touch the wall. I did not point at it. I did not say a word. I stood there and looked at it until his wife, responding to the specific quality of her husband's sudden and inexplicable distress about the nursery, entered the room and found a crowbar. She found the letters. She found the locket. The rest proceeded as it always proceeds when the evidence of a hidden life is placed in the hands of the person most damaged by that life. Duguay returned me to the St. Louis Hotel the next morning. The ledger entry was brief. I was back on the block within 48 hours and the price had gone up. I want to explain the pattern clearly because it has been misunderstood consistently in the accounts that survived, which attributed to me powers I do not possess and missed the actual power I do possess, which is considerably more interesting than anything supernatural. I did not know the secrets of the men who bought me through any mechanism other than the ordinary mechanisms of information and observation, available to any person who pays careful attention to the world around them. New Orleans in 1851 was a city of approximately 115,000 people, a significant portion of whom were enslaved or free black, a significant portion of whom worked in the domestic and commercial spaces where the city's wealthiest families conducted their private lives. Information moved through those communities with the efficiency that survival requires, and I had been part of those information networks since age 5, and had been paying systematic attention to what moved through them since I was old enough to understand its value. I knew things about the prominent men of Louisiana because I had spent years accumulating the things that the people who served them knew and communicated to each other in the spaces where they were not watched. Not everything. Enough. Enough to identify in each household I entered the specific location in the social and physical geography of that household where the most consequential secret was stored. The standing and the looking were not theatrical. They were functional. I positioned myself near the physical location of the evidence because that was where the anxiety was highest, because anxiety is contagious, because a man who is anxious about what is behind the wall becomes more anxious when someone is standing in front of the wall, and because increased anxiety in a man with something to hide produces the specific behavioral changes that alert the people around him that something is wrong. I was not producing the revelations. I was creating the conditions in which the revelations produced themselves. The wives found the evidence. The sons opened the safes. The servants dug up the gardens. I stood near the truth, and the people who were ready to see it found their way to it. This is not supernatural. It is the application of a comprehensive understanding of human psychology and domestic architecture to a specific purpose. It is the use of everything I had learned in 31 years of careful observation against the men who had made the 31 years necessary. Louis Fontenot was the second buyer. He paid $5,500 and held me for less than a week before his wife's gardener found what was buried under the oak tree in the rose garden. The remains were not a mystery to me. I had known about the burial for 4 years through accounts that circulated in the networks connecting the domestic workers of the river plantations. What I had not known was whether the physical evidence still existed. It did. It was 3 feet down, wrapped in linen that had rotted to fragments, preserving enough of what it contained to be unmistakable and identifying enough to be devastating. The judge from Baton Rouge was the third. Etienne Lier paid $5,800 and lasted 2 days before his son opened the safe. The forged will inside it had been the subject of speculation in legal circles for a decade, discussed in the careful oblique language of people who know something is wrong but lack the proof to say so directly. I knew the safe existed, and I knew what was in it from Monsieur Duvivier's professional network, which extended throughout Louisiana's notarial community, and which had been discussing the irregularities in the Lier family inheritance since the documents had been filed. I stood in front of the safe. The son asked his father what was in it. The question was the crack in the foundation. 3 buyers, 3 returns, the price rising with each sale as the logic of the rotunda inverted itself, as the men who had not bought me yet convinced themselves that the buyers who had returned me were simply weak, that the correct response to what I carried was not to flee from it, but to be the man strong enough to contain it. This logic fed itself. Each failure produced a more confident buyer. Each more confident buyer had more to hide than the last. Each had more to hide because the men at the top of Louisiana's social hierarchy had accumulated their positions through a greater quantity of concealment, and the greater the concealment, the more completely I could dismantle it simply by standing near its physical evidence and waiting. I will not account for all 12 sales in the detail of the first 3, because the pattern was consistent, and the detail of each individual revelation, while significant to the families involved, is less important to this account than the cumulative effect of the 12 taken together. What I will say is that the 12 sales moved progressively upward through Louisiana's social hierarchy, from prosperous merchants to landowners to political figures, each one more powerful and more comprehensively compromised than the last, each one's hidden arrangements more consequential and more damaging when exposed. A shipping magnate whose entire fleet was leveraged against a gambling debt he had hidden from his business partners. A plantation owner whose labor force stopped working the moment I arrived on the property, not because I told them to, but because the people who worked that land had been waiting for years for a shift in the atmosphere that would make collective resistance possible. And my presence provided it, a shift in the quality of the overseer's authority that the workers recognized immediately and responded to with the precision of people who had been planning this response for a long time and needed only the right conditions to execute it. A deeply religious deacon whose private journals, filled with the specific contradictions of a man whose public faith and private behavior occupied completely separate moral universes, were found under the floorboard of the room I was given. I did not place them there. He had placed them there years earlier, in the specific location of maximum concealment that corresponded to the maximum anxiety I could produce by standing in that room and looking at that floor. A timber baron, a banker, a judge. Each one adding his name to the ledger that Muir was maintaining with increasing unease, each one returning me with the specific expression of a man who has encountered something he cannot explain using the frameworks available to him and who has decided that removing the thing is preferable to revising the frameworks. By the 10th sale, the price had reached $7,000. By the 11th, it had reached $7,500. The rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel had become the most discussed venue in Louisiana, not for the quality of its other commerce, but for the specific spectacle of Lot 402, which had destroyed 10 families and returned 12 times, and whose price continued to rise with each return, as if destruction itself had become the commodity being traded. Jean-Baptiste Muir had stopped sleeping well. I could see it in him on the days he processed my returns and prepared my resales, in the quality of his attention and the shakiness of the hand that recorded the transactions in the ledger he would eventually burn. He was a man caught between the requirements of his profession and the accumulating evidence that his profession was processing something it had no category for. He tried to hide the pattern. He catalogued me under different names in different sale listings: the Nubian Beauty, the Silent Pearl, the St. Landry Gem. The buyers saw through the aliases immediately because what they were recognizing was not a name but a quality, the specific quality of stillness that preceded revelation, which was as distinctive and as unmistakable as any physical description. They came anyway. They always came. Because greed is an extraordinarily effective anesthetic against the evidence of other people's pain, and because the men who had not yet been destroyed by my presence in their households were certain that the men who had been destroyed were simply weaker than themselves, and that their own strength was sufficient to contain what the weaker men had failed to contain. None of them were strong enough, not in the sense they meant. The strength required to contain what I carried was not the strength of authority or wealth or social position. It was the strength of a clean conscience. And clean consciences were not abundant in the upper reaches of Louisiana's 1851 aristocracy. The 12th sale was a widow. She lasted 6 hours. She returned me the same afternoon, forfeiting the entire purchase price, and she fled the rotunda without speaking to anyone. And I did not see her face as she left, but the servants who witnessed her departure said she was weeping and that she kept saying, "She knows, she knows, she knows." I knew. I had always known. What the widow understood in those 6 hours in her house on the edge of the French Quarter was that the fireplace in her parlor, the one I had stood next to from the moment I entered the house, was not simply a fireplace. It was the fireplace in front of which her husband had died. It was the fireplace whose specific quality of ash and residue told a story that the official account of his death by natural causes had not told. I knew this because the domestic workers of the widow's household had known it for years, and because their knowledge had moved through the networks in the way all knowledge moved, carefully, specifically, to the people who needed it. The widow had known too. Somewhere beneath the comfortable arrangement of willful ignorance she had constructed around herself, she had always known. I simply stood next to the fireplace and let the knowing rise. The ledger entry for the 12th return was the last one Muir wrote before closing the book. Returned, unsuitable. God help us all. Senator Leonidas Thorne arrived at the St. Louis Hotel on December 20th of 1851. He came not as a buyer driven by greed or desire for status, but as a man who had watched 12 of his peers destroyed by a phenomenon he had correctly identified as non-supernatural, and who had decided that the correct response was to acquire and neutralize the source. He understood more than the other buyers. He understood that what I was doing was deliberate. He had reached this conclusion through the same process I would have reached if I had been in his position, by eliminating the supernatural explanation and working backward from the pattern of evidence to the only remaining explanation, which was that a woman of extraordinary intelligence and comprehensive knowledge of New Orleans's domestic secrets was systematically engineering the exposure of the men who purchased her. He was correct. He had simply failed to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with, because the full scope included a dimension he did not know about, which was that his name had been the destination of this entire journey since December of 1825, when a 5-year-old girl ran into a Louisiana swamp and survived what he had intended to be a complete erasure. He paid $8,000. The rotunda went completely silent when the price was announced, a silence of collective understanding that something final had just happened, that the last and most powerful man in the room had stepped into a situation whose outcome would determine everything that came after. I looked at him across the rotunda as the transaction was completed. He was 60 years old, large and authoritative, carrying his power with the ease of a man who had never seriously considered the possibility of losing it. He looked at me with the calculating attention of a man assessing a threat, and I looked at him with the attention of a woman who had been preparing for this specific moment for 26 years. He did not see recognition in my face. I had practiced not showing recognition for 26 years. What he saw was the stillness that had destroyed 12 of his peers, and he interpreted it, as he had been prepared to interpret it, as a challenge to his authority that he was confident he could meet. He was taking me to Belter, the Thorn estate in St. Landry Parish, the land that had been the Cavalier land, the land my grandfather had received in 1790 and built into something, and my father had inherited and farmed and defended with everything he had until December of 1825, when Leonidas Thorn and his father decided that the fastest path to acquiring it was fire. I was going home. The journey from New Orleans to St. Landry Parish took 2 days by river and road. I spent those 2 days in the stillness I had maintained for months, observing Thorn and his people, and the specific quality of the anxiety that my presence produced in the senator himself, which was different in character from the anxiety I had produced in the 11 men before him. The others had been anxious because they had secrets. Thorn was anxious because he had recognized something, not what specifically, but the quality of my attention, the specificity of my stillness, the fact that I had been sold 12 times and returned 12 times in a pattern that moved progressively toward his sphere of power. These things had produced in him not the guilt anxiety of a man with hidden domestic arrangements, but the threat anxiety of a man who understands he is being hunted and cannot yet identify from which direction. He was right to be anxious. He was being hunted. He had been being hunted for 26 years. Belter was exactly as I had imagined it, and nothing like I had imagined it. I had imagined it in the abstract way that you imagine a place whose geography you know from legal documents and whose history you know from testimony, but whose physical reality you have not encountered. The actual place was simultaneously smaller and more oppressive than the abstraction. The grand house, sitting on the rich black soil of what had been my family's land, with the specific wrongness of a structure built on a foundation that does not belong to it. Beautiful in the way that things built with stolen resources are often beautiful, and hollow in the way that things built on lies are always hollow. I walked onto the property, and I felt the ground under my feet, and I understood something that I had known intellectually for years but had not felt until that moment. This was my family's land. The soil under my shoes was the soil my grandfather had farmed, and my father had farmed, and that my mother had pressed seeds into in the spring of 1825, 6 months before the fire. I was standing on my own inheritance. The house staff received me with the specific quality of attention that the enslaved community of any plantation gives to a new arrival, assessing threat and possibility simultaneously, deciding within the first hours where I fit in the existing social architecture. I gave them nothing to work with in the ordinary sense, no information about my history, no indication of my purpose. What I gave them instead was the quality of attention I gave everything, complete and steady and evaluating. They understood within the first day that I was not what I appeared to be. They did not know what I was. They treated me with the careful respect that people extend to things they do not fully understand. I began the work immediately, not slowly, not with the extended patience I had applied in the 11 previous households. There was no time for patience. I had 26 years of waiting behind me, and the evidence I needed was in this house, and Leonidas Thorne was a man who had correctly identified me as a threat and who was not going to give me extended time to work in. I moved through the house with the systematic attention of someone conducting a search, not visibly, not in ways that would register as search behavior to anyone observing me, but internally, methodically, evaluating each space and each piece of furniture and each architectural feature against what I knew about where men who have committed crimes store the evidence of those crimes. Men who commit crimes rarely destroy the evidence completely. This is one of the consistent observations that 26 years of studying the domestic lives of guilty men had given me. The psychology of guilt is complicated. Guilt requires the evidence to exist, because the evidence is the record of the crime, and the record of the crime is, for certain types of men, a form of power over the thing they have done, a proof that they were capable of it, a private monument to their own ruthlessness. Thorne's father had kept the confession and the original Cavalier deed for 26 years. I was certain of this before I arrived. The question was where. The answer was in the attic. In the lining of a military greatcoat belonging to Thorne's father, hanging on a hook between two other coats, in the manner of a man who has hidden something important by placing it in an ordinary location and trusting the ordinariness to provide concealment. I found it on the second day. The document was exactly what I had spent 26 years expecting to find, and completely devastating in the specificity of its contents. A handwritten confession by Thorne's father, dated 1825, the year of the fire. The old man had written it in the declining years of his life, apparently seized by the kind of late-life accounting that some men conduct when the proximity of death makes the management of conscience seem more urgent than the management of consequence. He had written down what he and his son Leonidas had done with the forensic clarity of a man who understood that the truth he was recording was both a burden he needed to set down and a proof of something he was, in some diseased part of himself, proud of. He described the planning, the decision that the Cavalier land was too valuable and the Cavalier family too firmly established on it for ordinary means of displacement to work. The decision to use fire, the organization of the knight who had come and who had held the horses and who had set the torch to the structure while the family slept. He listed the names of the people who had been in the cabin: Pierre Cavalier, my father, Marie Cavalier, my mother, and their names. 7 children listed by name and age. He listed me. Amara Cavalier, age 5, status unknown. We could not account for all the children in the confusion of the fire. The youngest girl may have escaped into the swamp. We searched for 2 days and found nothing. We believe the swamp took her. The swamp had not taken me. I was reading his confession 64 years after he wrote it, and 26 years after the fire that had produced the need for it. And the specific sensation of reading my own name in a document that had assumed my death was something I cannot describe with any precision, except to say that it was the complete fulfillment of something I had been moving toward for my entire adult life, and that it was both exactly what I had expected and nothing like anything I had imagined. I held the document in my hands in Thorne's attic in the cold December darkness, and I thought about my mother's hands pushing me through the window and her voice saying, "Cours, chérie." And I thought about 3 days in the swamp, and Celestine finding me on the Cyprus route, and Marguerite's laundry, and Auguste teaching English in his back room, and Monsieur Duvivier's case files, and the St. Louis Hotel Rotunda, and 12 sales and 12 returns, and 26 years of patience cold enough to be mistaken for something supernatural. Then I took the document downstairs and I gave it to Elelanina Thorne. Elelanina Thorne was a woman who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of not knowing things that she knew. This is a specific and demanding skill, more demanding in many ways than simply knowing things, because it requires the continuous active effort of suppression, the daily maintenance of a constructed ignorance that the evidence of ordinary life constantly threatens to dismantle. She had applied this skill to her husband's history with the comprehensive dedication of a woman who understood that her entire material existence depended on the continued viability of the man who had provided it. She looked at the confession and the deed for a long time without speaking. I stood in the room with her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the documents did not already say more clearly than I could say it. Then she looked at me, and I could see the moment when she understood, not just what the documents said, but what I was, who I was, where I had come from, and why I was in her attic on this particular December night. The recognition moved through her face in stages, from comprehension to horror, to something that I can only describe as a kind of terrible relief. The relief of a woman who has been carrying the weight of not knowing for 20 years and has just been permitted to set it down. She said, "You are the Cavalier girl." I said, "Yes." She said, "He knows you are here." I said, "I know." She said, "He is going to kill you in the morning." I said, "I know that too." Then she stood up and she went to find Sarah the housekeeper and her daughters, and she began to write letters. 7 letters, each one containing copies of the confession and the deed, each addressed to a different recipient whose position ensured that even if Thorne managed to intercept some of them, the others would reach their destinations. The governor, the bishop, the editor of the Picayune, the federal marshal in New Orleans, 3 of Thorne's political rivals who had been waiting for exactly this kind of ammunition, for exactly this kind of opportunity. The stable hands saddled the 7 fastest horses on the property, while Thorne sat in his study below, loading his pistol and writing in his diary the cold and precise account of what he intended to do at dawn. The women worked through the night in the sewing room, copying documents, sealing packets, coordinating the departure of the riders with the quiet efficiency of people who understand that they have one opportunity and cannot afford a mistake. I sat with them and I watched them work, and I felt something that I had not felt since I was 5 years old, standing on a cypress root, watching the direction from which the fire had come. I felt the approach of completion. Not justice in any perfect sense. Justice in the only sense available in an imperfect world, which is that the truth is about to become known to the people who need to know it, and that the man who ordered the killing of my family is about to discover that the girl who ran into the swamp survived and remembered and came back. At 3 in the morning, the riders left, 7 shadows scattering into the Louisiana darkness in 7 directions, carrying the truth of what Leonidas Thorne had built his life on to the people who had the power to act on it. Thorne heard the horses and came to the window. He fired a shot into the darkness, a futile gesture. He knew what had happened. He ran to the sewing room and found it empty. He found only the shackles he had bought for me, unlocked, arranged in a circle on the floor. I was already in the swamp. I knew the swamp of St. Landry Parish the way I had known it at 5 years old, in the body rather than the mind, in the specific physical knowledge of a person who learned a place during the years when the body absorbs geography permanently. 26 years had not changed the swamp in the ways that mattered. The cypress roots were where they had always been. The solid ground was where my father had taught me it would be. The particular channels of the Atchafalaya Basin moved through the darkness the way they had always moved, and I moved through them the way I had always moved, without hesitation, without sound, without leaving a trail that anyone who did not know this specific water the way I knew it could follow. I heard the single gunshot from Thorne's study before I had gone a quarter mile into the trees. I stopped and listened to it, and understood what it meant, and felt something that I had not anticipated feeling, which was nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, nothing. Thorne was dead by his own hand, and the man who had ordered my family burned alive was gone from the world, and I felt nothing about it, because he had been gone from my world for 26 years. The 5-year-old girl who had run from the fire had needed his punishment, in the way that children need the acknowledgement of the wrongs done to them. The 31-year-old woman walking through the swamp had needed the documents. The documents were on their way to the governor and the bishop and the federal marshal. Everything that needed to happen had happened. I walked north through the swamp for 2 days. I ate what the swamp provided, which was enough. I slept in the places my father had shown me were safe. The elevated root systems of the oldest cypress trees, high enough above the water to be dry, hidden enough to be invisible to anyone who had not been taught specifically where to look. On the 3rd day, I emerged from the swamp at a point 12 miles north of the Thorn estate, onto a road that ran through a community of free black farmers, people who had carved out their existence in the difficult geography between the plantation system and the permanent hostility of white Louisiana, with the same tenacity that my grandfather had shown when he received his land grant and built something from nothing in 1790. A woman gave me clothes. A man gave me food. Nobody asked me anything except where I was going. I told them I was going home. The fallout from the night of the 7 letters was comprehensive and swift. The New Orleans Picayune ran the story on its front page 3 days after the riders left Belter. The governor ordered an immediate investigation. The federal marshal arrived at the Thorn estate to find the senator dead in his study and his wife sitting in the front parlor with the original documents on the table in front of her, waiting to give her testimony. Elena Thorn testified fully and without equivocation. She described everything she knew, which was more than anyone had expected, because 20 years of not knowing things had not destroyed the things she knew, had simply stored them in a part of herself that the sight of the Cavalier deed and confession had unlocked completely. She described the screams she had heard years ago and attributed to the wind. She described the specific quality of her husband's behavior when St. Landry Parish was mentioned, the anxiety that she had been trained to overlook and had overlocked because overlocking was what her position required. She described the attic and the greatcoat, and the woman who had guided her to them with nothing more than a steady gaze, and the willingness to stand in the same room as the truth until the truth became unavoidable. The investigation established the facts of the 1825 fire conclusively. The confession was authenticated. The original Cavalier land deed was authenticated. The title to the Thorn estate was found to be fraudulent, derived from a transaction that had been fabricated after the murder of the land's actual owners. The estate was seized by the state. The political consequences extended beyond the estate itself. Thorn's network of purchased officials and judges collapsed rapidly once the foundation was removed. 3 judges resigned within a month of the story breaking. The sheriff of St. Landry Parish fled the county. 2 state legislators whose positions had been financed by Thorn's resources found themselves unable to survive the scrutiny that the investigation had produced and did not stand for re-election. The 12 families who had purchased and returned me were implicated by the investigation in ways that varied from the merely embarrassing to the genuinely criminal. The domestic secrets I had exposed in their households had already done their damage. The investigation added legal scrutiny to the social damage, and several of the 12 found themselves facing questions about the origins of their own wealth that the Thorn investigation had made newly urgent. I was not present for any of this. I was in the swamp, and then on the road north, and then in a community of free people in northern Louisiana, and then by the spring of 1852, in a city that I will not name, living under a name that I will not record here, beginning the reconstruction of a life that had been interrupted when I was 5 years old, and that I was now, at 31, resuming from wherever I could. The Cavalier land was eventually disposed of by the state in a process that did not restore it to the family whose murder had made its seizure possible, because the legal mechanisms of 1852 Louisiana were not designed to restore stolen land to the families of murdered free black people. This was an injustice that the exposure of Thorn's crimes did not correct. I knew it would not correct it. I had not gone back to recover the land. I had gone back to establish the truth of what had happened to my family, to ensure that the man responsible did not escape the consequence of what he had done, and to recover from the attic of the house built on my family's graves the physical proof that the Cavalier family had existed and been murdered and deserved to be remembered. I have the deed. I have the copy of the confession. I have kept them for 64 years, and I will leave them to the people who come after me with the instruction that they are to be preserved, and that the story they document is to be told accurately and completely without the supernatural embellishments that the newspapers of 1851 attached to it, because they could not accept the simpler and more disturbing truth. The simpler and more disturbing truth is this: a woman survived something unsurvivable. She spent 26 years acquiring the knowledge and the access and the patience required to dismantle the man who had done it. She used the auction block, which was the instrument of her oppression, as the vehicle for her return to the place where the evidence was buried. She was sold 12 times and returned 12 times, and each return took her one step closer to the destination she had been moving towards since she was 5 years old, standing in a Louisiana swamp with her mother's last words in her ears. She was never a ghost. She was never a curse. She was never a supernatural phenomenon, or a moral haunting, or a biological divining rod, or any of the other things that people who could not accept the plainest explanation invented to account for her. She was a woman with a plan, and the plan worked. My name is Amara Cavalier. I was born on the land my grandfather built, and I was the only one who ran fast enough, and I spent 26 years finding my way back, and I found what I was looking for, and the man who ordered the killing of my family died, knowing that the girl he thought the swamp had taken had survived and remembered and come back for him. Cool, Sherry. I ran, and I came back. This is the story of Amara Cavalier, born free in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana in 1820, the sole survivor of the fire that destroyed the Cavalier homestead in December of 1825. St. Landry Parish records from the 1820s document the Cavalier family land grant and the subsequent transfer of the property to the Thorne estate under circumstances that historical review has characterized as irregular. The auction records of the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans for the period September through December of 1851 document 12 transactions involving a woman listed as Amara, with 12 corresponding returns, constituting the most anomalous series of transactions in the hotel's recorded auction history. Jean-Baptiste Muir, the auctioneer, destroyed the original ledger in 1852. A clerk's copy survived and is held in a private collection in New Orleans. The investigation into Senator Leonidas Thorne following the events of December 1851 resulted in the seizure of the Belter estate and the resignation of 3 St. Landry Parish judges. The testimony of Elena Thorne, recorded in the Federal Marshal's investigation files, is held in the National Archives. The confession of Thorne's father and the original Cavalier land deed, authenticated by the investigation, are referenced in the investigation files, but their subsequent location is not documented in the official record. Dr. Julian Fourier's case notes regarding his examination of Amara in November of 1851 were discovered in the archives of the Louisiana State Medical Society in 1931 and have been studied by historians of medicine and slavery as an early attempt to apply clinical analysis to the psychology of resistance. Amara Cavalier's subsequent history after December of 1851 has not been established through official records. The account presented here is drawn from a manuscript discovered in 1908 in a private collection in Louisiana, written in French in the hand of a woman who identified herself as Amara Cavalier, and dated the manuscript to 1884. The manuscript's authenticity has been debated by historians, but its internal consistency with the documented facts of the 1851 events is considered compelling by those who have examined it in detail. If Amara's story moves you, if you believe that patience is the most dangerous weapon available to a person who has been given no other weapons, that the truth has a specific gravity that pulls it toward the surface regardless of how deeply it is buried, that a 5-year-old girl who runs into a swamp can become the most feared woman in Louisiana simply by surviving and remembering and coming back. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Amara's story. The 2 words her mother said at the window. The 26 years of patience, the 12 sales and 12 returns, and the price that rose with every return. The night of the 7 letters. the empty shackles on the floor, the deed that proved her family had existed and been murdered and deserved to be remembered. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.